So this story right here, this case right here, is pretty infamous in the true crime hemisphere, and it's also a story that I've been meaning to talk about and to discuss for a pretty long time. Obviously, I've been meaning to do true crime ASMR for a long time, but now that I've actually started the series finally, this case was one of the first cases that I wanted to do, and tonight that is exactly what you and I are going to do. This is the case of Chris Watts. Now listen, quick disclaimer. Obviously, true crime ASMR is not for everyone. If true crime ASMR is not for you, just true crime in general isn't for you. I actually think I hit 100 videos on this channel the other day, so pick one of my other videos. I don't need you in the comments talking crazy to me, bro. I don't need it. This video is for true crime enthusiasts like myself. I don't know what you do. Literally, I was gonna get some hot chocolate to go with this video, but it was just too many calories, and right now it's like 3 a.m. in the morning, so it wouldn't really worked out. Anyway, that's none of your business. But like I said, man, just snuggle in, get comfortable. I don't know, put in some headphones. If you do, grab a coffee, pretty similar to Coffee House Crimes. Shout out to my man, what's his name, Adrian? Hopefully I got that right. But anyway, sit back and observe. So, for anyone unfamiliar with the story of Chris Watts, even the people that are familiar, I'm obviously going to explain, what happened, give you my input, and obviously you guys can input in the comments, and we can go back and forth with each other, and you and I go back and forth. But this story it's crazy because now I've seen so many true crime cases, right? This case isn't as it's not as wild as some of the cases that I've seen are, right? But this case hits hard to home for a lot of people. It's one of them. I live in the UK, but in America, especially where this happened, it's one of those cases that's when you hear the name Chris Watts, it's one of those things oh wow, I know what you're talking about. But anyway, let's get into the story of what happened. So the story of Chris Watts is actually the story of his family. It's his story, yes, but it's actually the story of his family. But anyway, let's begin. So this story begins with a woman named Nicole Atkinson, and she was the best friend of a woman named Shannon Watts. In this case, Shannon was the wife of Chris Watts. Watts, right? And what ended up happening was Nicole, she ended up calling the police because she was trying to get a hold of Shannon, and Shannon wasn't responding. Shannon was supposed to go with Nicole to a doctor's appointment. Bear in mind, while all this is happening, in Nicole's head, she's very concerned, not only because Shannon is not responding to her texts, her calls, but because Shannon is 15 weeks pregnant at the time. So Nicole arranged for, her to take Shannon in the morning to a doctor's appointment. I don't think she was going to take the kids, but she was going to take Shannon anyway to a doctor's appointment. Like I said, there was no response when she knocked on the door. Her shoes were still by the door. Her car was still in the driveway. There was no response to texts and calls, countless. So obviously anyone would begin to feel very concerned, suspicious, because the things are just not adding up, right? And that's the thing also, like I said, I live in the UK, right? London, to be specific, right? And in London, we have something called TfL, Transport for London, right? Which means basically all I'm going to tell you is you can quite literally get from one side of London to the other side of London, from one side of London to the other side of London, very, very smoothly. London in and of itself is connected super well, so perfectly, between buses and trains. Some parts there's trams too, but buses and trains, as long as there's a bus station or a train station around where you need to be, you can get there. So well connected. In this, what was this, Frederick Police Department, in this area, this region of America, that wasn't the case. So if you wanted to go somewhere, you'd pretty much have to take a car. You can't walk there, especially being pregnant and having 2 kids, which we'll get onto a bit later. If you wanted to get to somewhere, you'd have to take a car, whether that's an Uber, whether that's your own car. So the fact that Shannon's car was still in the house was very sus. So like I said, Nicole ends up calling the police, and the police officer who arrived on the scene was wearing a body cam. And this body cam footage is basically the first interaction and the first thing that us, the people watching, saw. It was the first thing that we saw. This body cam footage is available on YouTube, of course, and this body cam footage is insane, yet to me it's so fascinating to just watch and observe, based on what we already know, of course, but it's just so fascinating to watch. Now, one of the first things that Nicole tells the police officer who arrives on the scene is that literally earlier that day, around 2 a.m. in the morning, around the time I'm actually recording this video, Nicole had dropped Shannon off from somewhere. I'm not quite sure. Shannon and Nicole were somewhere out, and Nicole had dropped Shannon off to her house at 2 a.m. in the morning, and Shannon wasn't feeling very well. That's when they agreed, okay, we're going to go to the doctors and see what's going on. Like, you're pregnant, we're going to see what's up. Hopefully everything's okay, everything's good. Obviously, let's say the appointment was at like 10 a.m. That would mean there's only a few hours removed from the 2 a.m. that she was dropped. So within 5 hours, within 8 hours, it's like to all of a sudden stop, cease connections with the person that you're supposed to take to the doctors is very weird and concerning. Shannon's pregnant, but already has 2 little girls. So Chris has 2 kids, 2 girls, and a 3rd baby arriving in 25 weeks. So basically the body cam footage goes on, and the police officer is going around the house. Houses in America are built so, like, it's crazy. Like, you can access a house in multiple different places. Anyway, it's crazy. You can only pretty much access my house, for example, from 2 entrances, the back and the front, but in America you can go around the whole thing. Anyway, it's crazy. So the police officer was going around the house, knocking on shit, seeing if he can get a response. You know, they were concerned that maybe, because Shannon was diabetic, they were concerned that, maybe she collapsed and fell down and she was unresponsive and they needed to get help for her, right? Bear in mind that the police officer, he wasn't allowed to enter the house, and we'll get onto that later. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit crazy, right? So during this search around the house, the police officer has his very first interaction with Chris and Shannon's neighbor. Don't know his name, but his neighbor was asked if he had seen his neighbors that morning, and he said no, right?
You seen your neighbors today? No? Okay.
Now, obviously, because of what's about to happen next, I am guessing in my head that him hearing that question from the police officer made him, maybe get all sus. So it's like, okay, cool. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start checking the cameras around my house, the Ring doorbells, and just the cameras around my house, just to see if I can see anything that could be of any help, right? But we'll get to that later. The police officer now calls Chris on his phone, Chris Watts, and he tells Chris about the developments and the situation. And then Chris tells the officer, okay, I'm on my way home. I'm around 5 minutes away. Whoa. Now, what I want you to do, I know you're relaxing right now, but what I want you to do is put yourself in Chris's shoes right now, right? So, you go to work, you leave the house around 5 a.m., 6 a.m. in the morning, yeah? And you're innocent, bear in mind. You're at work, normal work day. You get a call from the police, 5012. You get a call from them talking about, yo, where's your wife? Your kids are nowhere to be seen. Your wife's nowhere to be seen. What would your response be? Just think about it for 10 10 seconds, what would your response be? I know what mine would be, but my question is, wouldn't you, watching this video, hearing all of that context that I just talked about, wouldn't your initial response be to tell the police officer to breach the house and check for your wife, your pregnant wife, and your 2 kids? Like I said earlier, the police officer wasn't allowed to go into the house. Obviously, this is the law. If Chris hasn't given you permission to enter his property, unless the property is pretty much on fire, you can't go into the property without giving permission. It's civil rights. You can't go into someone's property, right? That's the only reason the police officers hadn't gone in yet. But I'm saying, like I said, given the context, wouldn't you have told the police officers to bust down that door and get in there and find my wife? Now, anyway, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, Chris finally arrives. Now, obviously, hindsight is 20/20. That being said, Chris's behavior was very suspicious. Like I said, put yourself in the position, right? Let's say you didn't give the police officers permission to breach your house and look for your wife and kids, but you finally get there yourself. What would be the first thing you would do? Because Chris, what he did, he shook the police officer's hand, introduced himself for some fucking reason. I probably need to edit that out, Dwayne, because you can't cuss apparently. I might just leave that in. Who knows? Maybe I'll just lower it really, really, really low. Anyway, shakes the police officer's hand, opens the garage door, not the front door. He opens the garage door. He proceeds to look into Shannon's car. He looks into Shannon's car for really slowly as well, for a good 10-15 seconds. The footage is all on YouTube. You should watch it yourself. It's quite fascinating just watching a guilty man try to cover up his. Anyway, it's maybe you're like me and you find stuff like that just fascinating. I love body language. Anyway, and then what he does, so after looking into her car, he did something, he put something somewhere, I don't know. He then sneaks into the house. He just slips in. No one really notices he's gone. Chris is gone for a total of 1 minute and 7 seconds, I believe, before he finally, after all this time, opens that front door for Nicole, the neighbor, and the police officer. And when he opens the door, Nicole's face, when she sees him again, is it's as if she... I'm gonna get onto that in a bit, because I want to talk about just how you would act if you saw someone acting sus. But anyway, so during the body cam footage, there were many and multiple key moments that happened, right? That probably weren't so obvious to Nicole, weren't so obvious to the officer, but to us with all our hindsight, and to forensics who would analyze this because this was evidence, right? They would analyze this body cam footage. This was Chris's behavior was pretty odd. It's pretty strange, and I'm gonna explain. Bear in mind that forensics team that would analyze this footage, they had detectives on there with years of experience. So they would, even without hindsight, they would probably notice things that you and I, the untrained eye, that's crazy, you and I, the untrained eye, I should be a rapper, wouldn't have noticed, but they would have noticed it even without the hindsight. But let me ask you guys the question again. Put yourself in Chris's shoes, right? So you've heard the context, you've heard everything that's happened. Now you're finally inside the home. Again, you're an innocent person. You did nothing wrong. You're just finding out this information brand new. This is the first time you've heard everything. You're very nervous, you're very afraid, you're panicking. What would you do? Because I can tell you what Chris did, but what would you do? See, me personally, I would probably be freaking out. I would be on the phone to people like Shannon's doctor, trying to call Shannon's relatives, Shannon's friends outside Nicole, even though Nicole was her best friend. So it's if she's not responding to Nicole, then it's but anywhere that she could have gone, I don't even care. I would have gone down to the grocery shop. I would have been like, yo, I gotta get out of it. If she's not here right now, I can't be here. I gotta be out looking for her. My response would have been so different. Yours probably would have been too. But I'll tell you what Chris was doing. Chris spent the most part of the time inside the house on his phone. But not doing everything I was talking about. Calling her relatives, calling the doctor, calling friends, calling anyone who could have seen her, calling the kids' school, anything. Chris spent his time on his phone texting someone. Well, it's assumed that he was texting someone because he was doing the texting motion, you know. His fingers were doing the texting motion, right? Now, obviously, hindsight would tell us that Chris was doing this to avoid eye contact with the officer, to avoid eye contact with Nicole, the neighbors, to avoid progressing the conversation when the police officer asking him like really, I don't want to say damning questions, but really questions that were like incriminating questions. Basically, he didn't want to answer them. And him being very passive and very like reserved would kind of like, it's basically an escape for Chris, right? Like I said, honestly, like, go, if you haven't seen already, I'm pretty sure 90% of the people watching this video have already seen this case and the body cam footage. If you haven't seen the body cam footage, I'd highly recommend watching it. Obviously you don't need to see all of it, but there are certain moments in said body cam footage before Chris arrives, as soon as Chris arrives, the moments inside the house, and the next part, which I'm going to get onto, which is like the most fascinating of all, right? If you haven't seen already, I would go watch it. It's so fascinating to watch a guilty human being try to portray their innocence when you watching know that they're guilty, if that makes sense. Just human beings, the way we are, like our mannerisms, the things that are out of our control. It's amazing. And during the body cam footage of inside the house, you can see that, well, you can't see the officer's face because obviously he's wearing a body cam, but the neighbor and Nicole, some of their facial expressions, it's like they were so confused and puzzled, right? I always bring up this analogy. Imagine you're hearing someone play the piano. Just a nice, I don't know, what do you call it, a symphony, right? Just a nice piano melody. And then all of us, so you're listening to it like this, you know, closing your eyes and just vibing, really nice. And all of a sudden, the person hits a wrong note in your head. Because you heard that wrong note, your whole vibe, it would feel like, because something's out of place, it's incorrect. But you can't really, in the piano instance, of course you can put your finger on it, oh, it was that wrong note. But in this case, when you're watching something happen that is so incorrect, it's just it's like empathy. I know how I would be reacting in this situation, and I'm watching you, Chris, react to this exact same situation, and it's just incorrect. Like how you're behaving, there's something wrong with it, but I just can't put my finger on it. Because a part of it is like, yes, it could also be just how you are, your demeanor, but there's something wrong with it, and I can't put my finger on it. That's how Nicole and the neighbors were looking at Chris throughout this whole body cam footage. But like I said, maybe that was just Chris, right? Maybe that's just his demeanor. Maybe this is just Chris and Shannon. Maybe Shannon and Chris have had this argument before. Like, they've already had tiffs before. Shannon has done this before. She'd go spend some time with her mom, her auntie, her other friend outside of Nicole, and then she'd come back later that day or a day later or something. Like, he's used to it. So to him, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that, oh my god, this is panic stations like it was that day. Maybe, but maybe not. He clearly planned the situation to look like it was a runaway situation, as in Shannon took the girls and ran. Because in the body cam footage, Chris walks in. into the room, and he did this twice. One of the times he walks in and he says, "The girls' blankies are gone. They never leave anywhere without them." So obviously if their blankets are gone, it would show that Shannon had taken them and they took their blankets because they never leave anywhere without them. So obviously Chris had nothing to do with it. It was all Shannon, right? But the second thing that Chris did was watching it was so like, right? He walks into the room where Nicole and the officer was. I don't have an earring, but he walks in with Shannon's wedding ring, and he doesn't make eye contact with any of them. He just walks into the room looking at the ring like these, talking about, yeah, it was on the bedside table. She left her wedding ring. All staged pretty poorly, to be honest, but this is all staged, premeditated. All of this would be used as evidence against him in the future, of course. First degree, because first degree is premeditated, right? All of this screams premeditation, right? Now back to the neighbor that I mentioned at the start, right? Remember the neighbor when I said that, the police officer came and asked him, "Yo, like, have you seen your neighbors?" He said nah, but then he went off to do something. This neighbor was, anyway, let's get into it. Remember when I also said that maybe this was just Chris' demeanor, right? Maybe this is just how he was. Maybe he's just a calm guy, even in the most stressful, uncomfortable, scary situations in his life. He's just super calm and emotionally unavailable, detached completely. Maybe, but maybe not, right? This neighbor, because this neighbor pretty much had like a perceptual advantage of knowing Chris to a decent enough level. The neighbor could tell when Chris was acting out of character. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the neighbor, better than you and I, better than Nicole, better than the police, could clock when Chris was acting sus. And boy, did he clock it. So basically, after checking Chris's home, the police officer now made his way to the neighbor's house, and the neighbor had like a big screen TV, and he set up the cameras that I was talking about. And he showed the police and Chris and the other neighbor and Nicole some pretty damning piece of evidence to show that Chris was the only one to leave the house that day at around 5-6 a.m. when he left for work. Remember, so Shannon comes back at 2 a.m. and then Chris is the only one to leave the house at 5 in the morning when he decided to go to work. But the most fascinating part wasn't even Chris realizing that his cover was pretty much blown because of that damn meddling neighbor and his damn camera that caught everything. It was the neighbor's interaction with the police officer once Chris leaves the room. Like, he leaves momentarily, he leaves the house momentarily, and as soon as the neighbor has a chance, has a slight moment with the police officer, he pulls him to the side and he's like, he's not acting right at all.
You just want to go talk to him? I'm going to get his info real quick. No.
The footage itself was pretty damning. I mean, so Shannon and the kids are not in the house at all, and Chris was the only one to leave the house that day. So forensics would have seen this, and automatically Chris was the prime suspect, number one suspect. And the following day, for some really strange reason, I don't know why these criminals do this. It must be part of their psychopathic nature, right? But very, very similar to Jody in the first true crime video that I dropped on this channel. Jody Aries, right? Aries. Well, however you pronounce her surname. Chris weirdly agrees to 2 different news station interviews. Listen again, put yourself in a situation. Would you listen, like I said, this could be considered normal behavior. Would you, watching at home, do 2 separate interviews with 2 different news stations talking about your wife and your wife's missing and all this and woo? Would you do it? Would you even be in the right frame of mind if you were innocent, that is, would you do it? Like I said, it could be described as something called shock trauma, where the person who is traumatized becomes really numb and, reserved about the situation in order to avoid confronting their emotions and the situation at hand and the trauma of the situation. So I guess, in a way, Chris's behavior, although very strange to us with hindsight, it could have been normal, I guess, right? But knowing what we know and the people at home watching, they were probably thinking exactly what you and I know right now. So basically 4 hours later, they called him into the police station as a prime suspect. I kid you not. This is probably what makes this case so popular, so notorious, let's say, so infamous. I think what ends up happening next is basically what makes it infamous, but what ends up happening next is Chris agrees to do a polygraph test. For those who don't know what a polygraph test is basically quite literally a lie detector test. If you did something horrible, let's say you stole that candy bar from Miss Wiggins' store, and Miss Wiggins is like, yo, would you like to do a lie detector test to prove your innocence? And you knew you stole it, would you do a lie detector test? I guess in some way in Chris's mind, him, even though the forensics and the detectives had him as the prime suspect, right? So to them, he wasn't this innocent guy going along with everything, looking all innocent. In fact, the more he's trying to be innocent, the more he's trying to play innocent, the more guilty he's looking. Very similar to Jody in the last video. These cases, they have like a pattern, a trend. He agrees to a lie detector test. And how lie detector tests work, basically, they hook you up. They ask you a bunch of base questions in which you're telling the truth. What's your name, or what is your name, Chris? Yes, that's the truth. So they read your levels. Is today Sunday? Let's say that there was a Sunday. Is today Sunday? Yes, they read your levels. Then they'll ask you to tell an obvious lie. Like, for example, if let's say you're born on the 1st of January, they'll say, were you born on the 2nd of January? You would say yes. Since that's a lie, they would get the reading of when you were lying. And then they'd ask you the questions that they wanted to ask you. Do you know about your wife? Do you know where she is? Do you know who the kids are? Whoop, whoop, whoop. Obviously, Chris fails in spectacular form, fails everything. He's a liar. He's a psycho. He's a murderer. He's a liar. Fails the complete test. Fails. Now, funnily enough, lie detectors and polygraphs, they're not admissible in court. So the forensics team, the detective team, actually did pretty good work here, because not only did Chris not have to do it, he wasn't legally bound to do it, and if he didn't do it, they wouldn't have gotten the confession that they eventually got out of him, right? Because he'd have too much leverage, if that made sense. Like, he wouldn't be under any pressure to give up their location. And plus, like, even if since lie detector tests are not admissible in court, even if he said no to doing it, that wouldn't be any evidence to say, oh, he said no to lie detector test, which means he's guilty, if that makes sense. So in court, like, the detectives wouldn't have been able to use any of this and give it to the prosecution. They wouldn't. But they did it in such a way, they played within the law, and they got exactly what they needed. So anyway, Chris's dad actually comes in. They call him from somewhere. I don't know, maybe he flew from somewhere, I don't even know. But he comes in and the detectives leave. And then Chris finally confesses to his dad, tells where the bodies are. I think this guy's a monster. Oh my god. He dumped his 2 daughters in an oil tank near his work. And his wife, he made her a little shallow grave and he put her body there. And that's pretty much the story. The story, though, does have, like, so if we're talking about motive, if we're talking about reasons as to why Chris did this, yes, I think he was a psychopath anyway, but reasons as to why Chris did this, let's talk about them. So, whenever you get arrested, the police seize your phone and then they start looking for information and evidence, right? Clues. Especially if you're the prime suspect. If you're just a witness, then they probably wouldn't do that. If you're the prime suspect, however, they read you your rights, your Mandarin, Miranda rights. You're the prime suspect. Boom, they can go into your phone, right? They found out that Chris was having an affair with another woman. Bear in mind, Chris, who was months ago quite overweight, had lost a ton of weight. Not only did Chris lose weight, Chris was working out. Chris was ripped. He changed his whole life, his whole body. His confidence and self-esteem was through the roof. And I guess in his mind, he wanted a brand new life. He wanted to pretty much erase his old life and start a new life with this mystery woman. And I guess that's the logic behind why he did what he did. I guess it wasn't easier to just file for divorce. Maybe he didn't sign a prenup and he had all the money, I don't even know. But it wasn't just easier to leave the kids alive. You had to It's actually crazy. But yeah, he ended up being arrested after he confessed. The trial happens and obviously he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. I think in prison he wrote a book or something like that. He did an interview or wrote a book or wrote like a, not a book, but like a letter, an open letter or some shit. It's so weird because Chris, this is why you can never really judge a book by its cover, because Chris, he didn't come across as that kind of person at all, but he was a monster at heart. Maybe he was always a monster, or maybe that monster, I don't know, but it's crazy nonetheless. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, or were interested, maybe not enjoyed, but were interested by this video. And obviously there's going to be way more of these in the future. I hope you have a good night though, good rest, good whatever it is for you. And yeah man, watch the body cam footage, follow the case like I did. Fascinating stuff.